Hello and welcome to this webinar focused on the challenging role of civil society in Belarus. My name is Sofia Strive and I'm working for ForumCiv as a coordinator of the Swedish Civil Society Network for Eastern Partnership and Russia, which is a network consisting of 37 Swedish civil society organizations engaged for Eastern Partnership and Russia. So this webinar will be focusing on the current situation in Belarus. And as most of you know, at the presidential election in Belarus on the 9th of August this year, Alexander Lukashenko declared himself as a winner. And this resulted in that civil society gathered in peaceful protest all over the country. And the people of Belarus clearly expressed their demand for free and fair elections, end of police brutality and violence against peaceful protesters, as well as the release of political prisoners. And the response from the Belarusian authorities have been brutal, but the civil society continues to show persistence, bravery, and innovation in the fight for a democratic society. And this webinar will have 4 speakers, which will present different perspectives from the ground from different actors. They have approximately 10 minutes each, and in the end of the session, we will have a Q&A. So in case you have any questions, you can post them in the comment section, and we will bring them up afterwards. The 4 speakers that we have today, we will start with Alicia Rudnick, who is a Swedish-based Belarus analyst and a chairperson for an NGO called Swedish Belarusian, which is the only formal organization of Belarusian diaspora in Scandinavia. And she will speak on the peculiarities of the Belarusian protests and how they are different from other protests in the Eastern Partnership region. After Alicia, we will have Lana Willebrand, who's an operational development officer at Union to Union, which is the Swedish trade union movement's organization for international development cooperation. Lana is born and raised in Minsk, but living in Sweden since 2001. And she will speak on the role of workers and why strikes are important in this Belarusian context. And then we will have Åsa Olsson, who has long experience as a freelance journalist and former board member in the Swedish Union of Journalists and former chairperson of Freelance Journalists in Sweden. She's also active in ForumCiv, which is an NGO supporting journalists in Belarus, and she will speak on the role of Belarusian journalists and their current situation in the country. And finally, we have Martin Engeby, who is the Secretary General of SILK, which is the Swedish International Liberal Center, and he will speak on why politics is not a dirty word and the role of democratic parties in Belarus. So after these 4 speakers, as I said, we will have a Q&A. So prepare your questions. And you will also be able to access this webinar after it's been live. So in case you want to, you can watch it again or share the link with friends, colleagues, and people that you think should listen to these kind of discussions. So without further ado, I will leave the floor to Alicia.
Hi, Sophia. Hi, everyone. I'm pleased to be invited for this important webinar because I think that Belarus has deserved attention for many times, but today we're living in a special period when Belarus got attention from all the countries in the world. And unfortunately, this is related to the fact that the country has experienced mass violence from the side of the riot police and Lukashenko's regime. So it's crucial that we now not only pay attention to the violent pictures, to the violent scenes depicted in the media, but also that we concentrate on the peculiarities of the protests and how has it happened to the Belarusians that they became some sort of the nation, that they became something more than they were considered a few years ago, for instance. And with that said, I would like to introduce the 4 points that I will discuss today. And this will be peculiarities of the protests or the results of the protests. One of them is the growth of the Belarusians as a nation. Second one is the non-violent character of the protests. Then I will discuss the decentralization and broad and wide character of the protests. And finally, I'll come to politicization of the country, of the nation. So when we talked about Belarusians for 10 years ago, we would rather talk about the nation that is not interested in politics, that is not really identified as a nation because Belarusians speak Russian, because Belarusians have the old Soviet flag, and because Belarusians are not interested in perceiving themselves as a nation. And those who were perceiving themselves as a peculiar and as a very different kind of people, they were referred to as nationalists or as opposition and radicals. So what we see today, due to the protests, is that Belarusians have finally defined themselves as a nation. They know their peculiar features. They know that Belarusians are different from Russians and Ukrainians, and that matters. They finally established their symbol, that the governmental flag and governmental coat of arms is no longer topical for them. They prefer the old one, the one that was used for them during the nation formation period in the beginning of the 20th century. So Belarusians have applied several features that help us to understand that they see themselves different from other neighbors, see themselves different from as a nation, as a people who are united under the similar values, under similar symbols as well, because we know that the nation formation period that started in Europe and finalized in Europe in the 20th century has not been finalized in Belarus, because it was abrupted by the Soviet Union occupation. And it's now finally the country is back to this process, almost 1 century behind many other states. And finally we see that this process is being finalized due to the, unfortunately, very violent and repressive reaction of the regime. When we talk about Belarusian protest in comparison to other countries, of course, everyone thinks about Maidan. But it's important to understand that there are several differences, significant differences with Maidan. First of all, it is that Maidan was at some point considered as quite peaceful protest, but what we see in Belarus today, that this is a really peaceful protest. I mean, as peaceful as you can imagine. It involves zero violence at all. At the first day, there were around like 5 Molotov cocktails thrown to the riot police, but it's almost nothing considering the scale of the protest when it comes to the number of people who participated in this protest. And protesters, even when they constructed barricades, they were deconstructing them in the end of the day and putting everything on its place, because it was considered as violating the order on the street. So Belarusians are not employing any violence, and they are just peacefully waiting and peacefully standing when they're getting beaten by the riot police and by the police representatives of other kind. And it's totally important, because there's been numerous studies that shown that totally peaceful protests, they have much more chances for not being discredited by the current regime in the eyes of international community, that they have more effect when it comes to persuading the justice system and persuading those judges or those judges and courts who are currently working for the regime to switch the side. There's also been some research that identifies the success of peaceful protests that's almost 12 times bigger than the violent protest success in reaching its goal. And when we think about Belarusian protests, the important thing is also to mention that it's decentralized. It means that different groups are involved in the protest, that it has been completely decentralized in the geographical terms, and not only in different towns and countries people have been gathering, but also in the different areas of the same town, in the regions of the city, in the different smaller parts of the town. And they were gathering together as a magnet from different parts of the town. They were coming together in the city center and then going back to their smaller regions. And at some points, the SWAT or the riot police were just surrounded by the protesters just because they were going from the unpredicted directions. And this is something very interesting because people just decide to wander around the cities in different spots and areas of the towns, and they are really, it's really interesting because it's coordinated through the social media, through the Telegram Messenger. That's actually quite independent as a source, as a mean of mobilization of people. Because in some way, it is Telegram was considered as a mobilization factor because it was one channel that was distributing different messages. But currently, there are number and hundreds and thousands of channels created by the people, by the neighborhoods, by the cities, by towns, where they distribute the messages and they decide where they will protest, what form the protest will take today, depending on the current situation. And finally, when we say that the protest is decentralized and very broad, meaning it involves different ages, gender, occupations, and the different forms of the protests that are not necessarily just standing on the same street and occupying the place, or just going to the main state buildings, municipality buildings. It's not like that. It's rather that the protest is taking different kind of forms, like solidarity chains, like walking in the city, wandering together, singing songs, drawing on the walls. Everything creative you can come up with, Belarusians have already done, I promise. And then the last point, of course, is the politicization of the country. If before a few years ago we could say that Belarusians were not interested in politics, then today we see that the truth is that Belarusians were deprived of the right to participate in politics, because as soon as they received some kind of hope, some kind of understanding that it's possible to participate in politics, they started to really actively participate, and probably even more active than some people in the European countries can participate normally, because they have this right and they take it for granted. But the Belarusians saw it as some tasty piece, and they really wanted to have it. And now we see that so many Belarusians are involved in political actions, even on the local level. And this is something fascinating that's happening in the country. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alicia. And I think you mentioned some very important points, both in terms of what the image from the civil society in Belarus, what it does with the image of the country for themselves, but also stressing how this protest had been entirely peaceful from the protesters' side, and the violence had come only from the regime and local authorities. And in terms of the strength and scope of these protests, it's impressive to see that it really covers, as you said, like all regions, rural and urban, and all people from all levels of society, young as well as old people, and from all parts of, from all stages in life. And therefore, also the creativity probably comes from that, the strength of having united everyone for the same cause. And you can see how this protest is taking different creative turns each and every day. It's something new that we haven't seen before. And to some extent, it's also valuable to see what this spark of a possible political change does to its citizens when they see that it's possible to do something to change this politics, and then the interest in politics that have always been inside of them can kind of reveal. So thank you so much for presenting these very important points from the view of the civil society in Belarus. We will now continue with Lana Willebrandt, who will speak on workers' involvement in the protests and why strikes are important.
Thank you. And I would like to also start as Lisa did with saying what's the most new thing in Belarus that happened lately, and it's people. Can we please start my PowerPoint presentation? So what's new in Belarus? People. Belarusian poet Dmitry Strotsev, I think he was one of the first ones who formulated this news like this, and I really love it. Next slide, please. Not everybody knows that there are actually independent trade unions in Belarus. Here you see their logotypes. There are not many. They have been created already in the 90s, and they've managed to keep their registration and their members. And even if the members, it's about 10,000 people we are talking about, each member is very valuable because those people, they made a conscious choice to become a member of a trade union. Because usually people become members of the state-controlled official unions just by being employed in a factory or a workplace without particular consent. Next, please. So to make the situation possible, as we see today, there were some preconditions. And of course, there are many different preconditions, but I would like to shed light on these four that I think are most important for the working people in Belarus. So some of them are positive, some are negative. But I think to understand what's going on, we really need to know how employment regulations look like in Belarus. And there people usually have short-time contracts from 1 to 3 years, maximum 5 years. And it's very few workers who have those 5-year contracts. The contract system is a very efficient tool for regulation of the market and for control over the workers. Then I also think it's very important to remember that the broad social protests started in 2017, and it was the first time when different social groups came out on the streets. And it's also the first time after a long break when the trade unions become very visible. And in particular, trade union rep, who led those protests. And those protests were in connection to so-called parasite tax, when the unemployed people were supposed to pay a fine to the state for being unemployed. Another precondition that I think also is important is this booming IT sector. And IT sector, it's also not so big, several thousand people working there, but they work in a totally different working culture that we also see how it affected their activities in the protests today. And the last precondition, which also important to think about, it's the relations with the European Union and Sweden. They have actually improved in the last 5 years. Political prisoners were released and the sanctions were lifted, but the political arrest continued. The system has not changed. And I think this kind of a better relationship with the European Union and Sweden kind of slowed down the European reaction in August. But we also, it's very important for independent unions that they were persecuted in those late years. And two leaders of this union that's been leading the protests in 2017, they have been arrested and they are deprived of the right to be leaders. Next, please. Here I would like you to show just a timeline from the start of the violence to the major strikes on the 17th of August, in just a week. At the most, there were about 50, 60 Belarusian companies and factories that went on strike. But it's very important also to know that already on the 10th of August, the independent trade unions went out with official letters and petitions where they said that they're against the violence and they demanded new elections. Next, please. So when we talk about importance of the workplace, what do I actually mean? Why it is so sensitive for the power? And it's because those few strategic factories that went out on a strike, like tractor factory and so on, they bring in currency to the state budget. And even though some of those companies are not so profitable as the majority of the state enterprises in Belarus, they still bring the currency, which Lukashenko depends on pretty much. Workers as a social group have not been visible in connection to the political protest in connection to elections before. But as we remember, they were visible in connection with the social issues. That's quite important. Then we also have seen that these short-term contracts, they have shown that employees of the state administration, state enterprises, they are a very important resource for Lukashenko to exercise control and to reach with the pressure basically everywhere in each and every school, each and every factory. Then another peculiar feature is that the Sunday marches and the solidarity actions have a very specific guild character. You know, people go out in groups according to their workplaces. Universities go all like teachers and technical personnel and cleaners, they go out together. Athletes, science academy, journalists, doctors, they go in their workplace related groups or in their guild groups. It's very interesting. But what significance those strikes had so far? I would argue that the only significance we can see at the moment is that they created this feeling of the majority. Because I'd say that even if the marches were really huge, if not the workers have started the strike, this feeling that the majority of society is against violence, against falsified elections, and for a change would not be as overwhelming. And in the new Belarus, the independent trade unions will have a major role to make sure that the reforms will not leave people behind. I think it's very important for future. Next, please. Here I'd like to show you that on this picture, those who can read in Russian, to make a strike is actually legally impossible in Belarus. So it's not a wonder that they kind of died out. But what is continued still, it's so-called Italian strike. And it's very fun that this special way of industrial action becomes so popular in Belarus. Italian strike means that people go to work, but they work according to the instruction. And you know, to work efficient according to an instruction is basically impossible. So the strikes are going on in different forms, and it's very important. Next, please. Another major moment that I think we need to think about is that everybody appeals to law. And at the same time, law ceased to exist. Law is used only to persecute and to stop the protests. The constitution is the only legal mechanism that gives people the right to strike. So workers appeal to constitution. Opposition refers to constitution, and Lukashenko refers to constitution. And we know that this constitution has been changed so many times to match the Lukashenko's needs. So it actually does not mean anything, what it says in that constitution. It doesn't have a practical meaning. Next, please. But what has a practical meaning, it's what Zinaida, one of the members of this independent trade union rep, has said. She said, people organize themselves. We are needed now more than ever to train them. And it is what I think is a really important kind of message that both Alicia said, and I also would like to emphasize this self-organizing power of the Belarusian people in many places, and not least at work. Because you know that at work, many different people gather from different social circles. They interact in a different way than when they interact in their Facebook groups or in their friendship circles. Workplace is a natural organized place. And here we have still a great potential that is now growing a little bit more under the surface. But I believe we will see more of it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lana, so much for highlighting this. I think it's really essential that we understand how the trade unions' role in this protest and what role they have played, and also the preconditions to having this kind of protest in Belarus in the first place. And I'm happy that you also brought up the relationship with the Belarus have developed with the EU and Sweden, and how that influenced the international response to the current development. And as you said, hopefully the new Belarus, however it will turn out, will not leave workers behind, since this protest have, as you as well as Alicia highlighted, been including the whole society in all different spheres, workers as well as all other people in society. So as a social group, workers have played a very big role in this and will probably continue to do so. I know that you unfortunately had to leave for another webinar. So thank you so much for your contribution to this one. I think it's very important to have these perspectives from union to union and your work in Belarus in these kind of sessions. And I would also like to encourage people in the audience to post questions in the comment section if there's anything you would like to know more about or like to have clarified or is interested in. So thank you, Lana, for joining. Next speaker up is Åsa Olsson, who will speak on the role of journalists and their current situation in the country.
Hi. The situation for Belarusian journalists is something that I'm very committed to, so I'm very happy to be part of this webinar. The first time I came to Belarus was through an assignment with Swedish Union of Journalists. This was in 2014, and I was attending a meeting organized by Belarusian Association of Journalists that organize independent journalists. And I named this the role of independent Belarusian journalists and their current situation, because I do not have a lot of contact with state journalists. I have been working and had exchange with independent journalists. State journalists in general are organized in Belarusian Union of Journalists that I don't have any contact with. I have been to Belarus several times, and the latest time was in March this year through an exchange with regional Belarusian journalists and ForumCiv that organize freelancers in southern Sweden. Next slide, please. Yes, here we have the press index from Reporter Without Borders. Many of you maybe know it, but I think it's good to have a look at it again. We find Belarus on place 153, and note that was before the protest started. Place 153 in a list of 180 countries. That is, in the bottom you will find Eritrea, Turkmenistan, North Korea, but you will find Russia at place 149. So Belarus is the country in Europe with the least freedom of press. And that is a European country to the border of the European Union. And this has been the fact for many years. And for many years, this fact has not been something that many politicians have cared for. We have been a group that been working with this, but as many of us know, it has been very difficult to get any general attention to this very frightening fact, very difficult situation for journalists in Belarus. Next slide, please. I will try to explain why the situation of the lack of freedom of press is so big in Belarus. And I have some quotes here from the Press Freedom Index. One of the burning issues today is prosecution of freelance journalists that contribute their materials to foreign mass media. And from this year, in Belarus, journalists working for independent media organizations as well as bloggers have long been favorite targets of the regime. Yes, Lana said that the constitution, they changed it so many times, so it doesn't really have any major role. And that is true because in the constitution of Belarus, it states that there is freedom of speech. But then there is an amendment to that, the Belarusian law on mass media. And there, the authorities has defined who is a journalist. And they have two restrictive terms. They say a journalist of a mass media or a journalist of a foreign mass media. And this means that according to the law, a journalist is someone who works for a mass media house or a foreign mass media house. And in practice, this means that many journalists that are freelance journalists are considered as non-journalists. And if they're non-journalists, they cannot get an accreditation. And it's illegal to this, according to this law, to work as a journalist without an accreditation that they cannot get. So it's like this catch-22. And it's not only writing about sensitive topics that could be a problem then for a freelance journalist. It could be the fact that they're writing, because then they are working illegally as journalists. Next slide, please. So what could it mean then in reality to be a freelance journalist? Here we have an article from the Swedish Union paper Journalisten, and the woman on the picture is Larissa Shushirakova, and she has a record that she happily would be without. She is one of the journalists in Belarus that has been fined most times for doing her job. This photo was taken when she was fined for working as a journalist. She was covering a rally in Homel in this spring, in this year. And she was sent to court on her birthday. And that was not a coincidence. This is a way of harassing journalists, to have courts, trials on specific personal days. She started to use these trials as a symbolic manifestation, as Alicia said, the creativity of the Belarusian democratic fighters, the creativity and humor we can see in Larissa. So this occasion, she dressed up very nicely with a dress, flowers, invited people to the court. Come and celebrate my birthday with me. And many people here in Sweden, we started a campaign that people could donate money. So we sent her a birthday gift also in connection with this trial. She's also a single mother, and she has witnessed that the police threatens to take her son because she is supposedly an unfit mother since she has been to trial many times. And when she tells that, I can see that many of us can feel the pain that she has, but still she continued to work as a journalist all this time. Next slide, please. You cannot see it, it's very small, but in the corner, in the left corner, you have the source to this. This is statistics from the Belarusian Association of Journalists webpage. You can go in there and look afterwards if you want to dig deeper into it. Here are all the journalists that had been fined. This is from this year, and the record year was 2018, when journalists were fined for working as a journalist 118 times. And many journalists got fines several times. A fine can be about 300 to 400 euros. That's more or less a monthly salary in Belarus. And many journalists get fined over and over again. Of course, that's economical stress, but also mental stress. Next slide, please. And here are, no, not that one, back. Yeah, thank you. Here are the repressions against journalists in 2020. And I cannot see now, but I think it's about 280 reports of the whole year. And just in August, 151 journalists were detained in August. And you can see when you go to you have the link there, several reports of beating and other horrible things. One of the names here in the list is Ilya Kuzniatso, that I talked to yesterday. He has had accreditation for the German television station ARD for 15 years, an accreditation that was taken from him on the 29th of August. Then he and his colleague had been detained at the police station for 14 hours after questioned why he was working for German TV, and he says he was treated okay at the police station. They brought him coffee and cakes, fine, but they were kept him for 14 hours instead for just a couple of minutes, as they said. Next slide, please. Yeah, how do you feel? I asked some of my colleagues in Belarus, how do you feel? Larissa says, I feel constant stress with the fear of detention and pre-trial detention center. I feel anxiety, feeling constantly insecure and under constant pressure. But still note, she continues to work. A journalist who wants to be anonymous said the situation is dramatic and I'm in the border of a nervous breakdown, unfortunately. Another says, all the stories that we write about torture, it tears on my mental health with a combination of lack of security. Back to Ilya Kuzniatso. I feel good. I think we're moving in the right direction. And I think that's really impressive. After what they're going through, Ilya and the other ones, they still say, I feel good, and they want to continue. One message from Larissa is, I feel the support from my colleagues from other countries, especially Scandinavia. And my anonymous friend here says that, please be kind as angels to us journalists, write message of support to us because we need it, and talk to the Swedish politicians. Next slide, please. Finally, there is no democracy without freedom of press. And I ask myself, and maybe we could ask ourselves that too, how would the situation be in Belarus if there had been more supportive actions from other countries for Belarusian freedom of press earlier? That is something that I would like to know. And yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot, Åsa. Thanks so much for your contribution. I think it's great that you share light on the threats and risks that current journalists in Belarus are facing today, and give us their voice on the reality that they face on a daily basis in terms of how they are being harassed, silenced, and hindered to technically do their job. And as you said, like, there is no democracy or democratic society without freedom of press. And therefore, this is something that we really, really need to put our eyes on. And with 151 journalists detained only in August in Belarus, this is one of the most pressing needs probably to look at in order to have a free information flows and to combat disinformation and propaganda from the regime. So thank you for giving us insight in the daily lives and realities of Belarusian journalists. I think it's very important to have their perspectives included in these kind of discussions as well. And thank you for participating and doing your important work.
Thank you.
Thanks. So we will now continue with Martin Engeby, who will speak on Politics is not a dirty word, the rule of democratic parties in Belarus.
Thank you very much. A lot of very good things have been said, so I hope I don't repeat ourselves too much. Just something about what I do. Silk is a foundation of the Liberal Party in Sweden, and together with the other party foundation, each serious party has a political party foundation that works with parties in other countries. We have been engaged with Belarusian politicians for many years, in Silk's case for 20 years. We discuss a lot of policy that parties have. I mean, parties do need to respond to all issues that occur in society, from pensions to taxes to domestic violence to all sorts of other issues. So we have a lot of dialogue on topical issues, and we have also been working a lot on elections, because this is the main problem in Belarus. We have had Belarusian observers observing the Swedish elections, and these reports have actually led to the Swedish election system now being reformed to strengthen the secrecy of the ballots, which isn't optimal in Sweden with so many little papers. I mean, everybody kind of works with what happened. I mean, how did we get what we are, where we are now? I would like to add some things to what has been already said. One thing is that we cannot underestimate the effects of the corona pandemic. The president responded extremely arrogantly to the pandemic. People could, with their own eyes, see that there was a pandemic going on. They saw full hospitals, and then government wasn't doing anything. Civil society actually started because the government wasn't doing anything. So the civil society started managing state functions, organizing their own, help programs or making masks or whatever. So they felt, well, if the government is not here and we are running the government, well, we may as well move into office. I would say that there has been an increasing awareness of electoral fraud in Belarusian elections. Last election, I think it was a year ago, was like the grand rehearsal for this one. It was very brutish, much more brutish than ever, and it was like flagrant attitude of the government saying that, well, we decide on election day, you can go and screw yourself if you don't like the way we manage it. And people kind of knew that, yeah, that wasn't the right thing to do. We should not forget that I think in unofficial figures, more than 30% of the voters voted for the opposition presidential candidate already in 2015, and much less was reported. So there's an increasing awareness, and election observation has kind of proven to more and more people that the elections are not right. We also, this time, we saw a crack in the facade. You had an established person in Viktor Babaryka said, I want to run for president. So for the first time, it's like, okay, the elites are not united. So we can actually, this is more of an open race than usually. And third, it was very, the presidential candidate who got now, we think, around 80% of the vote, ran a very good campaign because everybody could get behind the message of hers, which was that we have to organize real elections. I'm not a politician. I'm in this position because I want real elections. We cannot have our presidential candidates in prison. So these are contributing factors to actually tilting the relationship this time. I speak, I mean, my title is Politics is not a dirty word, and ForumCiv supports civil society, but there are a few things that we have to remember. One is that most serious parties grow out of civil society organization. You have a workers' organization turned into a workers' party or a social democratic party. You have farmers running for office, and today they're called Centerpartiet. You have religious groups that want, for instance, more prayer in school and more Christian values, and they organize in a party like the Swedish Christian Democrats. New issues come up like protection of the environment. You have a green movement. Some of them feel that, okay, actually to produce change, we have to move into where the decisions are made, and so we form a party. Then we've seen feminists and also, unfortunately, racist with a racist agenda. Also, you try to move it into the political arena. But basically, parties are self-organizing citizens, and they are no different from a civil society organization on the local level. There's no big money in being a member of the party. And when a CSO then runs for office, it metamorphizes into a party because it has to respond to all policy issues. You cannot only care about your own thing. You have to get into what you call pork and barrel politics, where you exchange favors, etc. So, and that's why people feel that politics is dirty, but it's the only way that decisions are made through compromises. But in any case, as much as we love civil society organizations, on election day, you cannot vote for them. I think that we see very clearly when we talk about wanting to promote democracy in other countries, I think we see very clearly again that democracy is about elections. We've seen, and when elections are fraud, people get really angry. When my vote is stolen, I get very angry. We saw it in Serbia. That's how Milosevic had to go. We've seen it in Moldova. We've seen it in Georgia. We saw it in the Ukraine with the Orange Revolution, and we see it now. So we have to be aware of this. We talk about promoting democracy, but there is a very critical point where even an autocrat does not sleep well, and that's on election night. So I think this is a very important lesson learned for all of us. So then related to that is then the question of, should elections be boycotted? And I think, again, it's clearly shown that they should not, because it is one of the few opportunities that the citizen have to actually express themselves. They are, after all, behind the screen when they cast a vote, even if it's not counted. And it's by a lot of citizens realize that they vote differently, that they will be able to then try to push for change when they see it hasn't been fairly handled. All right. I see I have 3 minutes left. I think some lessons learned, and I think are very important for civil society organizations to consider. it's very important to lower the threshold between political activism and civil society activism. That's why I said, the title for this talk is Politics is Not a Dirty Word. The decisions are made in a democracy. They are made in the parliament or in the local council. And there's no reason to see the people who are in there, see them as your enemies or as a lower kind of people just because they want to be inside the political process rather than outside. And if everybody wants to keep their hand completely clean, well, then you will leave the decision making to people who have less attractive values than yourselves from your perspective. So there should be very low thresholds between parties and civil society organizations. Parties need to have policies. They need to think. They need reforms. They need to push for reforms. And where will they get these reforms from? They will get them from civil society. And civil society can achieve their reforms by cooperating with the political party. So it's a win-win thing. And in the end, the party wants to change the world. That's one gain that it gets, and the other, of course, that the civil society, the members of the civil society organization, will most likely vote for them. All right, I have 1 minute left. The last thing I want to say is do not underestimate women. I think this was one of the most important mistakes that the regime made in Belarus. They did not take women seriously, and women have again proved that they are excellent political leaders. I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Martin, for sharing your views on this. I think your last point on how important the female protesters have been in this development is really strong, and something that I think will leave us all with fascination, inspiration, and motivation, because we have seen pictures and photos of thousands of women dressed in white with flags and flowers out in the streets, and I think it's really impressive to follow. And also, thank you for highlighting the link between civil society and political actors, and how election observation have proven to the people that this election in Belarus wasn't fair and wasn't correct. And that is why this whole protests have started and have created such a big impact on the society today. So thank you so much, Martin. Now we have the Q&A session. So we have a few questions from the audience and from speakers, but I will start with a question which is mostly directed to Alicia on what role does the Belarusian diaspora play in these protests?
I would say that the Belarusian diaspora has been extremely important when it comes to current election, because never before has Belarusian diaspora engaged so much in, first of all, collecting money, secondly, participating in the solidarity protests. For example, here we have today is the 31st day that Belarusians in Stockholm are gathering at the same square every day, despite rain, anything, because we kind of feel the obligation in front of Belarusian people that we want to support them by just gathering for at least 2 hours there and then talking about current events. So, and it happens in many of the countries in the world. What has also been done is that it triggered the formation of Belarusian diaspora in some sort of organizations. If before we had maybe 5, less than 10 formal organizations in the world that would unite Belarusian diaspora, now there are, I've heard at least about 10 being formed during the last week. That people are registering their organizations and really want to help Belarusian people. And of course, this solidarity donations that's been created on Facebook, they are also based not in Belarus. They are based by founded by the Belarusians, but not based in Belarus itself. One of them is in Netherlands. The other one is, I think, in the UK or Poland. So it's very important to see that people who left the country for many years ago, they're still trying to do as much as they can. And it's actually the biggest share of financial help that comes to Belarusian protesters or those who are striking on the factories. It comes from the diaspora. And it's not It's not surprising, I would say, considering the circumstances, because the diaspora representatives are usually those who are having more liberal, more democratic views on the world, and they would support democratic changes in the country. So honestly, it's just amazing to see how Belarusians are gathering around a single idea to remove Lukashenko from power. They are really willing to pay for former policemen if they quit their jobs. They're able to pay for some people who are fired from their jobs because of political views. So it is happening, and the diaspora is having a very great and considerable role.
Thank you so much. I've been really impressed when following these different demonstrations outside of embassies or MFA buildings all over the world. And I think it's such a huge strength that people come together for a joint message from no matter where you live, you can still support the protest in Belarus. Thank you for that. So I will continue with a question that I think is more directed to Åsa on how does the Belarusian journalist abroad contribute to the current changes in the country?
I must be honest that Belarusian journalists abroad is not a group that I have a lot of contacts with. I have a lot of contact with Belarusian journalists in Belarus and journalists in general. So I cannot answer that. But I know that the support from journalists in general from other countries as colleagues to the Belarusian journalists in Belarus is very important. And a lot of the Belarusian journalists that are independent, they deliver journalism to independent media broadcasted from abroad, like Belsat, or to the German TV station that I mentioned before, ARD. But that specific question, I don't know.
Yeah, thank you. And I can imagine it's a lot of media also being distributed through social media, regardless if you're from Belarus or not, but still interested in what's happening there. It's a lot of pictures and articles being shared. I think also you also had a question yourself. Do you want to post that yourself?
Yes, of course I'm biased. I worked with journalists for many years, and I'm a journalist myself. And I had the experience when working with Belarus that the Belarusian journalists were very lonely when their fight for democracy in Belarus. I did not experience that other group of people in Belarus were very dedicated to this fight. But of course, I'm biased. What would Alicia and Martin, what do you see in this? Were the journalists as lonely as I experienced?
I can start. I don't know how to really respond to that question, because it's on the psychological level, on mental level, and it's of course you would have to make great assessments to respond. But I do believe that journalists feel much more support than ever before, because they are supported by the ordinary citizens who are coming to meet them. For instance, when the dozen of journalists were detained recently, about a week ago, then we had like many people standing by this detention center by Akrestina, where they were placed, and supporting them with different messages. And I am sure that journalists feel it also through social media, they feel that they are not alone in the fight for democracy. But I cannot speak for them, of course.
Yeah, shall I jump in? Yeah, I heard the question, what can Belarusian journalists abroad do? What could be their role? And something that I've been, not so sure about is how useful is it that the European Parliament expresses condemnation of one thing or the other? How important is it that the Swedish Parliament says something? How important is it that the minister says something, etc.? But I've learned over time that it's very important actually to feel that you're not crazy, it's your regime who's crazy, and that the rest of the world is standing behind you. It's very good for your morals. So I think it's very important for Belarusian journalists outside Belarus actually to seek for those statements and to report them home. I think it's important, without inventing them, of course. Another note I want to take about journalism, and I think all journalism is very important, but I think that photojournalism and imagery is more important than ever. And I think many of the images that are coming out of Belarus today, just a picture of something that's going on, women lined up against the wall with a homo OMON kind of guard looking at them or something. All of these pictures are extremely efficient in keeping up the support, I'm sure, inside of Belarus, the outrage and indignation within Belarus, but also the outrage and indignation from around the world. So I think that's a note that I take with me. Thank you.
Thank you. We have another question from viewers in the audience. One follows: many Swedish companies work with Belarus, for example, IKEA. How do you think this should be handled? Urge them to stop, or is the interaction with democratic countries something that should continue?
Can I comment?
Of course.
I think that's a very, very important question. And actually, we started some of the journalists here in Sweden have started to ask IKEA, so how do you see about you doing business in Belarus? And I got one answer that we respect blah, 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 yeah, human rights. And I said, but how you do not do that, because you do business in Belarus. So it's just fancy words. And I'm a freelance journalist, but journalists in Sweden that have a platform, like journalists on SVT or SR, big daily newspaper, you have the platform already. Look at this. Because how can a big company have these fancy words of respecting human rights and do business in Belarus? It's immoral and it's double moral, and that's a very bad moral. So, and I think it's important that the Swedish mass media also look at how did we report on Belarus before this started? Because we as freelance journalists, we have tried to sell our piece articles to the big media in Sweden, and the interest was very, very limited for many years. And that's the coward role from Swedish mass media, that no one wants to report about something that no one else reports about. So now it is okay to report about Belarus. Of course they should. But we should have been reporting from Belarus for many, many years. It has been a very bad dictatorship in Belarus since 1994. So they do it now because everyone else is doing it. That's shameful. And IKEA, listen, journalists, go and get there. But that's a very good story. So hurry up, so you're the first one, okay?
Martin and Alicia, do you also want to comment on this?
Yeah, I'm reluctant. I think it's difficult to draw the line, and I think publicly traded companies in Sweden like H&M and others, I feel much safer about them than the alternative companies that would move in. So I'm reluctant. I think it's really important to check them, because if you don't check them, they will not behave good. But at the same time, we have to realize that IKEA is not responsible for dictatorship in Belarus. It's the president of Belarus who's responsible, because sometimes we start to see the people in other countries not as actors of their own destiny, and we kind of assume that everything can be decided in the West, and then you play in to the rhetorics of these countries saying that the West is almighty and powerful. So I'm reluctant, but I'm not suggesting at all that we should not look at what the Swedish companies do. We have to, but we should also look at other things. I would like to highlight the fact that sports is big business, and that Belarus again will be part of organizing the International Hockey Championship. And I think that this is an area, a business area, that we have to look much closer at. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I can see that we have a lot of more questions from viewers, and thank you for being so active in posting them. But we only have a few minutes left, unfortunately, so we will have to wrap up. But it's nice to know that it's so high interest in this topic, and I think this protest has really shown to be a unique and very successful and strong one. So this kind of discussion will continue for sure. But to wrap up, I will pose a question which is fairly broad and could be interpreted in different ways, and that is on how the possible future scenarios for civil society could be seen in case of either Lukashenko's stay in power or a re-election in Belarus?
I can try to take it on, and I think that obviously, even for the experienced political analysts and experts, it's very challenging now to try to predict anything, because we don't know what are the dialogue, what is the dialogue between Putin and Lukashenko, what is their meeting about the next week, and how the protests will turn the way around. Will there be some shift in opinions from political elites inside the country? So all of those factors make it very complicated to predict the future. But when it comes to the civil society, it is definitely that we can observe that there is point of no return. We see that the Belarusian civil society has already grown and developed to the point where they see themselves as a society that is ready to learn how to work out together, how to function as a democratic civil society. And this involves even the local cooperation, and it's some sort of communicative strategies of political action, strategies of solidarity, and even strategies of co-financing. All of this has been developed in just 1 month, and I think given the circumstances of political instability, this experience of Belarusian civil society will just increase and improve, and Belarusians will continue to work on the better and stronger civil society.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any quick comments on future scenarios?
No, it's impossible to say what's going to happen. I'm optimistic. So if I had to actually bet money, I would bet money that we have elections within 6 months. But I may very, very well be wrong. But I'm just an optimist. But we have to realize that this is really a marathon, and Churchill said that this is the beginning of the end, or the end of the beginning. I don't know, this is the beginning of the beginning. This is really, we don't even know if we're going to get to the next stage. And then in the next stage, there is also lots of snags to hit, as we can see in other Eastern European countries. Sometimes a revolution can end up in disappointment, as it did in the Ukraine, etc. So we have to know that when we talk about democracy in the world and democracy in our neighborhood, we're in for the long haul. It's not the one-off thing. That's why we need long-term programs like Sweden has had with Belarus, and that kind of work needs to continue. Thank you.
Also, any last words on this topic?
Yes, that we have to be prepared to support our Belarusian colleagues and the fight for democracy for a long time, and not like now the interest is very big that we leave them in a couple of weeks. I will do my best to stay within this topic and with my colleagues for many years, and I hope that the Swedish media and other civil society will also do that, and politicians in general.
Yeah, I totally agree, and thank you for highlighting that this support that we can see now all around the world should continue even after it's a hot topic in media on what's happening in Belarus. And I think your quote, Martin, on that this is the beginning of the beginning kind of sums up this discussion quite well, on that it's very difficult to foresee what we will be able to face in Belarus after this protest is over, but hopefully it's something to the positive. So we will have to end this discussion here. I hope some of the viewers, if you're interested in following up on some of the questions that we didn't have time to address, then feel free to reach out and we will connect you with the speakers, and hopefully you will be able to get a response that way. Otherwise, see you in other channels and other discussions on this topic. And thank you so much to the speakers for contributing to this important discussion.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you very much. It's been
Thank you very much.